The Gravehawk is trying to take that same approach and do the same thing with Ukrainian stocks of air-to-air missiles, again, short-ranged, heat-seeking ones. So the R-73, which we've also seen Ukrainians successfully using, for example, recently to shoot down a Russian helicopter in the Black Sea off an uncrewed boat with one of these air-to-air missiles. So basically truck-mounted, primarily counter-UAV air-to-air missile repurposed as a SAM. My name's Justin Bronk. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Air Power at RUSI. The Gravehawk is a system that has been developed with cooperation between the UK and Ukraine, essentially building on experience very successful experience with a sort of DIY surface-to-air missile system that the UK developed as an urgent requirement for Ukraine several years ago, which combined the RAF's, it's called AIM-132, or ASRAM for Advanced Short Range Air-to-Air Missile. Essentially, we put life-expired missiles, ASRAM missiles, which are normally used for relatively short-range air-to-air engagements with fighters, so heat-seeking. And we put them on supercat trucks with a sighting and sensing system to enable engagements. And these were very, very successful and continue to be successful against particularly UAVs in Ukraine. So really helpful in protecting Ukrainian forces from strikes coming in from UAVs with a much cheaper interceptor missile, in the case of the ASRAM, compared to something like Patriot or the AIM-120 AMRAAMs or AIM-9Xs, even that the NASAMS medium-range system that the Ukrainians also have is using. So building on that experience, the Gravehawk is trying to take that same approach and do the same thing with Ukrainian stocks of air-to-air missiles, again, short-ranged, heat-seeking ones. So the R-73, which we've also seen Ukrainians successfully using, for example, recently to shoot down a Russian helicopter in the Black Sea off an uncrewed boat with one of these air-to-air missiles. So basically truck-mounted, primarily counter-UAV air-to-air missile repurposed as a SAM. The Ukrainians have a fair bit of experience at this point with testing ground-based applications of the R-73 short-range air-to-air missile. Clearly, it's a pretty short-range system. It was never designed for long-range engagements, even from an aircraft. And on a fighter, it's coming off a rail with a lot of existing speed and altitude, so it has a lot more energy than if you're firing it from the ground. But the Ukrainians have been, there's been footage of them being used in a maritime context on these uncrewed boats for essentially as a means to deter Russian helicopters from trying to intercept Ukrainian uncrewed attack boats, which are so one of the normal ways that Russian forces defend shipping is to use helicopters, and so there's been these tests. And so in terms of testing of the Gravehawk system, which is the land-based version of the British approach with ASRAM, it's building on quite a lot of test experience that the Ukrainians and partners already have, particularly with these maritime-based applications. So the 2025 package deal includes a reasonably significant amount of particularly howitzer ammunition, attempts to resupply air defences, again, Gravehawk being a key part of that as well, likely manpads, Martlet, which is a relatively lightweight missile that's designed to, or LLM, lightweight laser-guided multi-role missile, I can't remember the exact term, but LLM, which is essentially, again, a counter-UAV missile, primarily, with also some helicopter applications. And also there'll be a whole raft of other assistance, but I suspect the exact composition of that aid package will be in a bit more flux than was intended, given the events of the past few weeks with the US, and therefore a greater emphasis from the UK and other European allies in trying to cover perhaps gaps that might now appear in the Ukrainian inventory that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. So certainly the Gravehawk is an example of promising ways that Western partners and the Ukrainians collectively are managing to come up with relatively non-traditional ways of filling certain ongoing munitions requirements and weapons requirements. The other obvious one being the huge use of one-way attack UAVs in lieu of larger numbers of traditional cruise missiles to strike targets deep in Russia. As always with these things, there's a huge amount of dependencies and complexity behind the scenes. So a lot of these systems are not necessarily as effective as they might appear in and of themselves. They require other things around them to make work effectively. But essentially, the even before the Trump administration's recent very, very significant pivot on its position on Ukraine, there's been a recognition for quite a while that traditional exquisite munitions procurement for things like Patriot interceptors, long-range cruise missiles, just isn't keeping pace with the rate of expenditure. And of course, it's not just Ukrainian expenditure, but also, well, in the case of Patriot, there's a lot of expenditure around the world. There's continued ballistic missile attacks periodically in the Gulf, for example. And a lot of countries also gave up significant stocks in order to give to Ukraine. They want those stocks replaced yesterday. So there are basically limits, serious limits on almost whatever you spend on how many of these exquisite munitions can be built in a given amount of time. And so Gravehawk is an example, along with many others, particularly UAV type things, where the Ukrainians and partners together have been trying to find ways to replace as much as possible the capabilities that were traditionally provided by bigger systems. And in the case of Gravehawk, it's not really aiming to replace something like Patriot. What it's doing is trying to make it much, much easier to conserve the ammunition stocks the Ukrainians have for Patriot, NASAMS, and other high-end air defenses by giving them something with a much cheaper effector to shoot down Shahed 136s or Garan 2s, so that the one-way attack UAVs, or LAN, Zala, Forepost, other types of reconnaissance drones, so that they're not having to engage those with those big, expensive, scarce, long-range interceptors, and can save the latter for things that low-end systems like Gravehawk simply can't deal with, most notably ballistic missile threats, where Patriot and to a lesser extent the French SAMP-T are basically the only things that can handle those classes of threats. If the Trump administration were to fully cut off any supplies of military equipment to Ukraine, I mean, the big question there, given their rhetoric over the last 2 weeks, that it looks like they're pretty set on moving towards a position where they stop supplying US-funded aid, at least in the short to medium term. But the question becomes, do they still allow partners and the Ukrainians themselves to buy American equipment, or do they just go for a full freeze? If it's the latter, I mean, there are whole categories of kit that there just isn't another source for. Patriot interceptors being a good example. Now there is a production line being set up for Patriot in Germany, but that might start producing some missiles maybe by next year. It's not going to replace the requirements immediately, and this is also the case more widely for European security, because essentially, while there is obviously the spending delta, and frankly the UK is now lagging behind quite a lot of European allies in increasing defence spending to meet a very obviously different threat environment than even 2 years ago. But European allies, European members of NATO as a whole, have very significantly increased spending, and I suspect will continue to do so now. The problem is there are some things that only the US provides, and only the US can provide in even the medium term, because for most medium-sized or small nations, it is so expensive to cover the bases, if you like, so provide a brigade of mechanized troops, some fighter airplanes, some helicopters, some tankers, a few ships. If you are a relatively small country, that kind of covers most of your budget, just to cover the basics. And so when you're looking at much more niche capabilities, particularly things like space capabilities, where the vast bulk of the alliance's military space capabilities are for communications, surveillance, intelligence gathering, targeting assistance. All of these networking are provided by the US. It's not a case of, well, if Europe all spent 3% of GDP on defense, we could quickly replace the US capabilities there. They're not replaceable. It would take a decade and vast amounts of investment. There are other niche areas where you could fill in the gaps slightly more quickly, but there are still pretty much total gaps at the moment. Airborne electronic attack is one, for example. And part of this is by design, because the reason it's not just inadequate funding. The reason our forces are in such poor shape to suddenly deal with the Russian threat without the US doing specific bits of the heavy lifting is because the US ask for the last 25 years has been to provide expeditionary force packages to help fight America's wars following the only time that NATO has ever had an Article 5 declaration, which was 9/11, after which we spent 20 years fighting America's wars as good allies. And to do that, we really changed our forces very significantly away from the Russia-focused Cold War style forces that we had. So in the UK, for example, you would see the Royal Air Force went from, I think in 2005 or 6, they had about 460 combat aircraft, and today we've got about 160, if that. But what we do have today is vastly more fixed-wing heavy lift, so C-17, A400, tankers, MRTT, and a lot of helicopters, so huge Chinook fleet. It's not quite as big as it was, but it's still pretty large. We've just retired Puma, but there's an ambition, at least on paper, to replace that with a new medium helicopter, plus Merlin helicopters, plus Wildcat helicopters. A lot of fixed-wing ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, for permissive environments, essentially spy planes for looking at communications intelligence, that kind of thing. The force, in other words, is now optimized to support enduring counterinsurgency and stabilization operations alongside a US coalition, because that's what we had to do for Iraq and Afghanistan for 15 years. And so pivoting back is going to take time. In terms of the optimism or pessimism, it fundamentally depends, for Ukraine at least, on whether the US administration decides that they want to actively pressure Ukraine into accepting essentially a de facto surrender, which will put them in an untenable security position and thereby are likely to get rolled over completely in the relatively near term. The Russians are not likely to give Ukraine a year or more to essentially lick their wounds and, even from a disadvantageous deal, kind of build themselves back up to a point where they're much harder to invade. So any deal, given that the Russian position is currently, particularly thanks to the US statements and decisions over the past few weeks, enormously strong. They have the battlefield initiative, and all the pressure is being put on the Ukrainians, not them, which, given that the Russians are the invaders, is astonishing. From the Russian point of view, therefore, there's very little reason to make any sort of concessions. And you see this from Russian rhetoric. I mean, they're already talking about far greater things than just Ukraine. They're talking about US troop withdrawals from Eastern Europe. They're talking about all sorts of stuff. And so if the US president decides that he wants a deal that is catastrophic for Ukraine and European security and would therefore be rejected by both, and wants it enough because he's convinced by the Russian lines or just doesn't really care, that he wants to force it through, he would have to get fairly punitive with Ukraine in terms of maybe cutting off all ability to supply, not just US supplies, but all ability to send US equipment from allies, etc. That's a very different world than one that was imaginable a month ago. But the thing is, other than that, I mean, Ukraine is not going to accept a deal that's done over its head between the aggressor and a third party, albeit a very important third party, the US, that puts it in an untenable security situation where it's just going to be reinvaded within months from a far worse position than it's in now. So they'd have to be forced to accept that sort of thing. So yeah, in terms of Europe's ability to backfill, it really depends on what the administration's position becomes. if it's just the US cutting off support, but we can still essentially spend more money and buy American equipment for the bits that Europe can't make itself, then that's perhaps not a catastrophe. I mean, it's still pretty bad, but it's perhaps not a catastrophe. But if the US starts blocking allies from sending US equipment, then that's going to be a really big problem, because there's whole areas we can't replace quickly or easily. And it is worth stating, Europe has been providing more aid to Ukraine in both financial and absolute terms for nearly 18 months now than the US. So this idea that Europe has been freeloading, which in security terms has been true for 20 years, but specifically on Ukraine has not been true for quite a while now. And particularly Germany, if you look at where, which allies have been doing the most to help Ukraine, in terms of some of the partner assistance, the UK has consistently been the first among allies in that. In terms of material assistance, actually, after the US as an individual donor, Germany is by far the biggest. So, given how much flack Schultz often gets for a lot of European positions that Germany has taken on certain things, it is worth restating. Germany has actually provided a huge amount of aid, and particularly industrial capacity as well, whether it be armored fighting vehicles, air defense, ammunition. They've done some good stuff.